We model ourselves after a NIST cybersecurity framework, which whether it's that diagram or the one that you now see on your screen, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it reminds us of three simple facts. One is that the first and most important thing to do in any when thinking about your security posture is to think about and identify what you want to protect. So you'll notice on the left-hand side as you kind of start into this process, thinking about what you want to protect, the data, where it exists, what threats are to it, and most importantly, what value do you place on that? I think all of those things are going to help you establish a proper mindset and budget for ultimately, all the other elements of the cybersecurity framework. Number two, I like this diagram because it shows that detection is central to our security efforts. Okay, a lot of organizations focus too hard, if you will, on the protection area and don't know when they're under attack or when they've had a breach. Detection is a very important and centralized piece of the puzzle. And third and last is that the time and money spent on reaction, or the red aspects of this, is equally important to prevention. And so to my comment earlier about spending too much time and effort on the left-hand side of the equation without as much on the right is to the detriment of your entire security plan. So the four stories we're going to look at this month that have been in the news are this. The first one is a fine little collection agency. This would be similar to like a 23andMe or I don't know, My Ancestry. This one in particular was called MyHeritage. This is a classic issue with regards to credential problems, a little bit of mismanaged data, a little bit of oversimplified response, and we'll mix that in with some modern day stuff about modern authentication and some poor messaging, in my opinion. So we'll dive into that story a little bit. We're going to visit, as we have, I don't know, every quarter or so it seems this story comes up, but we're going to talk a little bit about patching and specifically what got released, not in a lot of detail, but in terms of volume, and kind of review our own patch management practices and policies. Last month we covered a lot of stories, three of them specifically, that I just want to kind of give an update to because ironically a lot has happened in 30 days. The stories were VPNFilter, which was your router story, you might recall, the Russian router, I think people are calling it. We also discussed a story about location services in the bottom right, and there was a ton happened there, including a Supreme Court case, and GDPR. We just introduced it really last month, and hopefully you were well ahead of it, but if you weren't, you got a brief snippet last month, and certainly there's been a lot of updates in that department too. So that's just kind of a general single story in terms of some updates along those stories. And the fourth and final story we're going to talk about is cryptocurrency and cryptojacking, or crypto mining. Some interesting developments in that space relative to ransomware. So without further ado, that's your preview. Let's dive in. Good old MyHeritage. So MyHeritage has 92 million members. Okay, not a significant, not a insignificant number. In terms of an application, these are again where they're collecting DNA information on folks. They have this DNA information very importantly accessed, and to front end some of this information, you get into the site with a username and password. So unfortunately for them, their logins, which essentially were email addresses, and a hash of their passwords was all found in a single file and available on the black market this month. A researcher had found it and said, hey, what site does this belong to? Oh, wow, MyHeritage, here's all the users. Now, traditionally what can happen with a file of that nature is you can run it through some algorithms, and depending on the hash that was used, oftentimes you can expose the passwords to it. This hasn't happened yet, publicly at least, that someone has been able to breach through the hash yet. It's typically a matter of how what they call sprinkled it, but it's presumably on an update probably 30 days from now, I'd come back and tell you that sure enough, 92 million people, have exposed logins and passwords relative to the protection of their DNA. So I guess my messaging out of this is that, and I quote directly from the article, it is 2018 and two-factor authentication is not new security technology by any stretch. A word of advice: if a website or application you trust with sensitive personal or financial information doesn't offer some form of multi-factor authentication, it's time to shop around. Okay. This is DNA information. This information, you can imagine, can be used for nefarious purposes, such as screening you and making sure that you couldn't get health insurance, or basically aggregating data regarding collections of people, maybe that were leveraging the site, things of that nature. So very personal in nature, protected again with a login and a password. Not necessarily the strongest mechanism for protecting it. So I point out to you that multi-factor authentication is widely being considered for various applications. Certainly a lot of your data for your organization, whether it be health data, personal data, business data, HR data, resides oftentimes in Office 365. People have moved a lot of their messaging, sometimes SharePoint, OneDrive, Skype information is moved up there. And I want to make sure that you're aware that there are services to provide multi-factor authentication for Office 365. It's included by default with your licensing, or there's some paid-for licensing that provides some enhanced things called conditional access. Either way, from our perspective, it's either a turnkey project, or we do have some services for helping you evaluate the security posture of your 365 on a weekly basis, and making sure that you're continue to be in a good spot. So the story first, is multi-factor authentication becoming and needing to be commonplace, and the secondary part of that is the fact that it can be done as a turnkey solution. Patching. Good old patching. Well, we've got a patching story. Essentially this month, Microsoft had a pretty significant Patch Tuesday, as they call it. About 48 patches were put out for various vulnerabilities that they alluded to. Approximately 25% of them, or 12 of these patches, were deemed as critical. Okay, and critical is the highest level of Microsoft's patching scheme. So a significant patch need this month, and many of those patches were relative to browsers, but one specific example that they gave was DNS. DNS is obviously important for traffic to traverse around in the DNS in Windows 7 to 10. Okay, and you can tell yourself, do I have any of these systems, right? Do I have any Windows 7 devices? Probably a lot of them. Do I have any Windows 8 devices? Probably a lot of them. Do I have any Windows 10 devices? Probably a lot of them, right? So you're immediately highly impacted. Or Windows Server 2008 to 2016. So it's pretty much your entire Microsoft footprint is impacted by DNS vulnerability. And people were actively out exploiting it. There was something that allowed remote code execution, right? So meaning people can actively engage with and take over that system. So the patch is necessary, it's critical, and it sounds like it's broad. You need to get it on all systems and quickly and efficiently. Combine that with Adobe Acrobat Flash Player, which also came out with a critical alert, basically a 0-day, which was being actively exploited out in the wild. Anyone using version 29.00171 or earlier. There were some articles out there, and this has been a debate really for the last year, about if you don't need Flash Player, it should be removed from all your systems immediately. Flash has probably gone through 20 or 30 security updates in the last 2 years. It's something that immediately you have to stay on top of on a monthly, if not weekly basis. So the time frames are short, the need for it is extensive or critical, and the ability to deploy it is broad. So with all this said, I only want to point out the following, which is I learned this morning that we are, and I'm putting my laser pointer on, we have a number of services we do for customers. I learned this morning the specific number that from a patching perspective, we are responsible as an organization for patching, and 100% responsible for the patch levels on a monthly basis for 1,700 systems. Okay. We're able to do this efficiently because we have tools, process, and people dedicated to patching, right? This is what we do. And we take it off the shoulders of other IT folks so that they don't have to worry about it. That we can get this out in a broad way to a number of systems. We know when there's an issue with a patch in terms of how it gets deployed and things of that nature. But we're responsible for 1,700 systems, and I think that's a good testament, I think, to our strategy and our approach there. Equally, from an antivirus perspective, we have 950 systems by which we manage the antivirus, and we're responsible for any outbreaks on those devices. So we've taken over from a strategy perspective, and I guess with this in mind, I guess I would throw out there the following concepts, which it's unreasonable nowadays to have servers or workstations that are not patched, or have antivirus that's out of date or not installed, or users that are not trained. Even all three of those are highly regarded now in terms of what's reasonable. And so when it comes to the end of the day, if you're having an outbreak and it's like, oh yeah, I missed a few servers this month, or we didn't have a strategy for it, it's becoming more and more unreasonable for that to be occurring. So those are just some thoughts around patch management. Again, broad and deep needs. So again, on those update stories, as a reminder for those that maybe attended last month, from a location services, I won't rehash the story, but there were a number of third parties out there, Securus, this one was called Location Smart, and literally because of breaches on their webpage, Location Smart's webpage is located, you actually could just type in anyone's cell phone number and get their location right now. Right? It was real-time location information for mobile devices. And there were a number of entities, Securus, Location Smart, that were literally chartered and had contracts with T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, and others to gather this data. And usually it was for law enforcement purposes that this was provided. But because of breaches in their own system, your data was actually exposed, or if someone was trying to track you, that was available to anyone. So last month, that was the part. The update this month is that there's two updates, actually. There was a Supreme Court ruling last week where it was determined that police need a warrant for this mobile location. And what that did is, after that, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile all basically stopped their contracts with Location Smart and with Securus. Okay, so from a business perspective, if you had stock in those organizations, they're probably having some issues at this point. In fact, it was Verizon that stopped all location services being offered to anybody until they do a thorough review as to who and where they were providing that information. So a big ruling, I guess, from the Supreme Court. And a second sort of thing that happened in the space is there was another location problem that occurred with Google Home devices and with the Chromecast, where basically there's some bugs in the software that were exposed that basically can provide location information for where that device is within 10 meters. And that information, they're not exactly how that information was going to be used, but long story short is Google agreed that there was a problem and a fix is coming in mid-July. So just know that location services is a hot topic for where people are real time. The Supreme Court has ruled in a narrow ruling, 5-4, about police needing a warrant for that and kind of what its impact on the industry, as well as the Chromecast items here. Another update quickly on GDPR. So last time, and GDPR is a pretty extensive legislation regarding privacy of data, and we discussed that last week. My goal is not to orient you again necessarily to this slide, but I guess the two updates that I would say from last month were the following. One, the deadline of May 25th, when this law goes into impact, has passed. Okay, as of last time, it had not. So more privacy policies have been updated. Likely you've gotten a lot of emails recently in your inbox. Hey, we've updated our privacy policy, and you probably don't look at it, or you just kind of accept it and move on. But a lot of significant businesses have updated their privacy policy. Have you? Secondly, there's been on the day that on May 25th itself, a $8.8 billion lawsuit, that was B with a billion, was filed against Facebook and Google for how they manage their privacy policies. Basically, someone in the industry who is pretty well heeled in privacy policy decided to sue them for these large amounts in an effort to say that, hey, the way that you collect data and relative to your security policy, your privacy policy is not accurate. It's kind of an all or nothing, and the rule says it can't be all or nothing. And so, we'll see where that lawsuit goes, but many, many more lawsuits are going to be tested in courts here soon. The other thing I'd point out is last time, and if you missed our webinar on this, we'll show you later, but we had significant updates regarding the talking points around this. We had a good one-hour discussion with customers, maybe about 30 customers last week. So if you missed that, we've got a snippet up on our website. The third update is around this thing called Russian router, or what more eloquently is being called VPNFilter. The two updates here is that while initially they had identified these number of devices that were listed on the right-hand side, this is the actual slide we showed, that actually number of devices went up 3 times to 70 different models that are now impacted and probably impacted with this malware. It also there's 2 times the number of compromises have occurred, meaning I think they thought that 500,000 devices had been impacted, and in fact they're saying no, more like 1 million. These are typically personal routers on the smaller end of scales, but they certainly could creep into smaller businesses. And the third aspect of it is the damage that can be done is way more damaging than they thought. They thought that essentially the goal was to just put this malware out there, and if you reboot it, things will be fine. And as it turns out now, these routers that have been impacted are basically under an area of complete command and control. They ask you not only to reboot things, but now your goal is to upgrade the firmware, disable remote admin, make sure that you have firewall services in there, and ideally set this thing up for updating automatically or patching essentially automatically. So, kind of the same story as what we had before, right? Patch automatically, firmware updates, and all of this leading to the fact that I want to make sure you're aware, again, in terms of devices, we've got about 600 devices where we have complete ownership of whether it be a firewall, a router, switches, and we are responsible for updating firmware and the security ultimately of those devices. We do this under what's called our complete set of services. So this includes vulnerability scans, looking at log events that might occur out of there, having a response team that can act on a 24/7, and even if you've got a number of devices, correlating those events from break-ins on a switch or a router to seeing some nefarious traffic on your firewall or on your servers. So we try to manage and coordinate all of those events through a correlation engine called a SIEM. Okay, the fourth and final story takes us kind of into a very modern-day world here, introducing a new term. And at this point, you just kind of get to sit back and listen to, what might be a kind of some news stories. So first on the left-hand side, what I gave you there is a graphical picture of what $31 million looks like. Okay, as you can see, it's a pretty big stack of money. I think we're all hopeful that that pallet gets dropped off at our door anytime soon. But if you were trying to steal this out of a bank vault, you'd need about 50 bags, right? Large bags. You have about 700 pounds of currency there. By the way, this is $100 bills. These are large bills. If it was 20s, just multiply that by 5. But 700 pounds, okay? You'd need a moving truck. You'd need, 50 bags. You'd probably need 25 people to steal this sort of money. And on the right-hand side is cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency, this $31 million was stolen in about 5 minutes and stolen from a South Korean bank known as, that trading firm was, I don't have the name right now. Shoot. The name of the organization in South Korea was is unknown, but it essentially is their largest cryptocurrency retailer in South Korea was hacked. They believe, obviously, the actors were North Korea. The reason they believe this is because their second largest cryptocurrency had also been hacked to the tune of $40 million. So $71 million was stolen in a matter of minutes from two of the largest providers in South Korea. They effectively closed down. This had 80% of the trades in cryptocurrency are not doing anything in South Korea right now. They've halted all deposits. They've put all the money in something called cold storage so that this doesn't happen any further until they can resolve what the problems are. But long story short is they got hacked and they lost $70 million like that, right? So less effort, higher rewards, definitely targeted, and that's one of the pains, if you will, of cryptocurrency. That's kind of only half the story. The other half of the story I wanted to mention around here was a term called cryptojacking. Okay, you're going to want to commit that one to memory because cryptojacking is taking over ransomware as the #1 cause of problems for businesses. And here's what's happening. Cryptojacking, articles kind of over here, ransomware had for the first time in Q1 of 2018, for the first time made what's called the top 10 list, had less impacts in the top 10 list than they typically have had. So you might argue that ransomware volume actually dropped in Q1 of 2018. Awesome. That's good news. Yay, we get to take a breather. Well, unfortunately we don't. What's happening instead is that cryptojacking is happening. And let me read you a description of cryptojacking in case you're unfamiliar with the term. So cryptojacking, just like ransomware, uses malware, typically via script loaded on a web browser. So when you're hitting a web page, or it could be distributed, and it's used to steal unused CPU cycles on your machine. Big whoop, right? My machine's acting just fine. And it uses them to perform cryptojacking calculations, right? So it's not your money. Your machine is just being used to, with CPU cycles, to go against someone else. And oftentimes it's through malicious JavaScript. And basically it could be used even on a browser as you pass over a website. It basically just takes your CPU cycles for the time that you're on that website. But one of the unique things about cryptojacking is that unlike ransomware, the success of this attack depends on not being detected. Right? Ransomware is right in your face. Hey, your files have been locked up. Give us some money. And cryptojacking is much more nondescript, kind of on the underhood. So what's happening with ransomware also is IT departments are on high alert. Right? You've had a year and a half of ransomware kind of being at the top, and you're doing some things. You've got backups of things. You're not likely to pay a ransom because you can kind of avoid this. You're hopefully getting better at patching. You've got advanced malware on your firewalls as well as on your endpoints. You're segmenting networks or isolating that important identified data from other systems, things of that nature. So all of a sudden your backups and patching and some of the root things are, because you're prepared, ransomware goes bye-bye, and now instead they're going to do cryptojacking. And cryptojacking kind of uses the same tools, same sort of people, but further looks at your security hygiene. It looks for, do you have good antivirus? If you have signature-based antivirus still, you're probably at risk. If you don't have a next generation firewall, you're probably at risk. If you don't have good patch policies, you're at risk. So all of these things are things where certainly Peters and Associates can help you. But get used to the idea of cryptojacking. Again, these are if you were doing if you looked at processes operating on your machine today, you might notice them there. But a lot of organizations just don't have a good handle on what assets are part of the IT assets, inventories, and what's running on those machines. So those are the cryptojacking. Just kind of want to introduce the concept and kind of orient your brains a little bit there. In sort of a wrap-up fashion, I want to point out the fact that we've got a series of blogs. Again, we're adding video blogs right out onto our website, so if you missed our webinars from yesterday, you can get some 90-second recaps, or if it is interesting to you, certainly the full webinar or the materials for the webinar are posted right into that same link.